If you're just joining us for today's class, which begins in just a couple of minutes, please make sure that you have downloaded the new handout. There's a handout that was not included just because they were trying to watch for length in the original set of handouts. So one of the handouts is on here. The other is a score of a prelude I will be playing at the end where we put together all of the ideas. So if you want to take a minute right now as we're waiting for everybody to join us to download that handout. So it would be the second handout. The other one is already included in your set of handouts from the workshop. So feel free to do that. Get comfortable. I will be playing some video clips today, which demonstrate some things. If you're sitting at a piano or an organ, feel free as I pause between to just try them out. They're very brief, and they're shown on there. They're also on your handout. So if you want to get that accessible, that would be a great thing. So go ahead and get settled, and we will begin in about 2 minutes. All right, and if you're just newly joining us, make sure that you get out the handout for today, although I will show you examples, and as well as the new handout, which is you can download from your landing page for this class presentation. So make sure you get that second handout right now. We'll give you a minute to do that if you haven't yet. And sit back and get comfortable. We'll have some fun. So welcome to the class, Creating Preludes and Postludes from the Hymnal. I'm excited that you're joining us today. We have a lot of fun things to talk about. Most of them are pretty easy to do. So if you don't feel like, oh, you're really wonderful at there yet, no worries. These are very accessible. So it's about a 40-minute presentation. And at the end, you can do a chat or a question and answer. And we'll go ahead and get started. So years ago, as a young mother, I was trying to get my kids ready to attend church while on vacation, far away from home, amidst the fatigue of Disneyland lines, too much junk food, overall vacation exhaustion. My son had forgotten his church shoes in the hotel, so his sister was happily creating paper ones for him from the word bulletin, along with a matching paper tie. Everyone was tired and bickering, begging not to attend primary in an unfamiliar place. Peace was the last thing I could feel at that moment. As we slipped not so quietly into our selected pew, hoping not to displace some other family from their favorite spot, I somehow caught the sound of the organ prelude quietly being played. Where can I turn for peace? As my mind caught hold of that message, it turned to the Savior, and I prepared my heart and my mind for the sacrament. Peace, or at least a little peace in my soul, took over. How often do we as organists wonder if anyone is truly listening to what we play? I have had that thought myself, wondering if my music only motivated people to talk louder instead of listening and prepare their hearts and minds for the service. But we can take comfort in the following statement from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints Handbook of Instructions. Music that is carefully selected and properly presented can greatly enhance the spirit of worship. Quiet prelude and postlude music creates an atmosphere of worship that invites the Spirit into church meetings. The organist or pianist usually plays hymns or other appropriate music for 5 to 10 minutes before and after a meeting. Playing hymns helps members review gospel teachings in their minds. I love that. Well, I think most will agree that quiet prelude invites people to come in and sit quietly and listen. If you have a problem with reverence in your ward or organization, you can encourage your bishop or leader to stand up and remind people to come in and sit quietly to prepare their hearts and their minds for worship. Playing louder really won't encourage them to sit down. In fact, I have found it very helpful to start thinning the harmonic texture, fewer voices, lowering the volume of the organ through registration changes, and adding bigger breaths between the phrases as it gets closer to starting time. It seems to make people listen and realize something is different about what's happening. Those spaces between the phrases really has worked some magic for me to get people to kind of listen and realize it's time to sit down. But does postlude have to be quiet? Well, not necessarily. It can be uplifting and motivating and assist people to quickly depart and get out of the building for the upcoming cleaning usually required during this pandemic, or if during regular times to attend their next classes. A triumphant conclusion is okay, as is quiet music that supports the topics of the service. Select carefully and prayerfully what will best help your congregation on that Sunday. I have had people often comment on the choice of hymn used in my postlude. They recognize that it supported something mentioned in the talks or maybe the topic. They do listen and they do respond. Well, here are a list of some great resources for prelude and postlude. They are also listed in the resources section of the class handout, so you really don't need to write them down. I just listed a few. There are many out there. But what if you've exhausted all of these? What if you can't find a prelude on a particular topic you think will enhance the congregation's preparation for the upcoming service? Or what if you don't want to continue to purchase new music every month? Well, you can create your own from the Hymnal. We'll cover some easy techniques for creating your own prelude music with specific examples on how to accomplish them. If you practice these techniques, they will become natural, and then you can add them in a pinch, such as maybe a Sunday that you forget your prelude book, or maybe the organist for that day is ill and you need to fill in and you don't have your prelude book. Maybe you need extra time because the sacrament isn't ready when you thought the meeting was going to start. Or maybe there's a last minute topic change, or maybe you feel the Spirit move you to play something different. Maybe you need extra time for practicing a particularly difficult hymn that week. Or maybe you just want to save money. Or maybe you just want to be creative. Whatever your reason, you can do this. Also, I would suggest that you prepare ahead what you plan to play for the upcoming Sunday. You'll feel a lot more comfortable in using these techniques with some practice. Write in registration. Write in notes that will assist you. Maybe you can write it out on staff paper if you find that that's helpful. You don't need to leave anything to chance, especially when you start out using a new technique. Also, maybe pick one or two techniques that you would like to start with. Get good at them and then work on additional ones. Build a toolkit of techniques. Well, let's start with some melodic alterations. Simply playing the solo melody in one hand with the left hand playing the tenor and the bass. Just drop the alto in order to bring out the melody more. It's a lot simpler if you drop the alto, leave the soprano melody, and just play your left hand as you're used to. Of course, you can do any other combination of voices, but that I find is the easiest way to start. So here's some great registrations that you can use when you use that solo voice, usually on a different manual. But if you do it on the same, if you drop the alto line, you'll hear it pretty well. But kind of fun to maybe try it on the swell, and on the great, you can use just a soft stop. So you can experiment with the ones that are listed here as well as in your handout to see what combinations you like, but I'll give you a sample now of two of them. The first one is the swell with an 8-foot oboe and the great with an 8-foot flute. The next one has the melody on the swell with an 8-foot viola, a string. And again, the great with an 8-foot flute and no pedal. Here's how that might sound. So I'm trying to give you a minute or two if you'd like to try them yourself as well. So you'll just hear just a little pause as you might like to try that. So you can also play your solo voice in a different register or different octave for an interesting tonal change. But instead of maybe playing it an octave higher or lower, you can do it with registration. So I'll demonstrate by playing the first solo on an 8-foot stop and then playing the solo voice again with a 16-foot stop. You'll hear it an octave lower. And then again on a 4-foot stop, you'll hear it an octave higher, but I'm still playing it in the same place that it's written. You can also play the melody with 6 in the accompaniment. So you see these are just 6 and they are moving up and then back down. You can play with Celeste for the left-hand 6 with right-hand melody on a solo stop. It makes a beautiful verse for a prelude or a section of a verse. Let's hear how that might sound. You can also play your hands with toccata patterns. This next example features the melody on the pedals with an easy repetitive pattern in both hands that just outlines the chords in the harmonic structure of the hymn. It's simply a repetitive 16th note 5-finger pattern with a skip between the first and second notes of each group. It's very easy to play, or kind of easy to play anyway, but it sounds really difficult. This would be a great technique for a postlude. Here's how it sounds. Another melodic alteration is to embellish the melody or another non-melody voice with non-harmonic tones. Passing tones simply fill in a missing note between existing thirds. Neighbor tones move away from a note by step and then move back to the same note. This adds interest to a repeated note spot. An escape tone can be used to add interest to a stepwise movement between notes by stepping away from the note, then skipping down to the following note, or by skipping away and then stepping. Here's an example of how this might be used to add interest in embellishing a melodic line. These techniques can also be used in any of the other voices. In fact, it works quite nicely in your inner voices or your alto and tenor. Could also be used in a bass. Here it is in a melody though. So you can also add interest with texture or the number of voices. Try playing manuals only with no pedal for a different texture if you are playing 4-part choral harmony from the hymnal. And maybe you could do one verse with the pedals and one verse with manuals only. That just makes it sound a little different. If one has a pedal and one doesn't, you'll hear that octave lower sound. But you can also layer or use 2 or 3 voices only. So here's some ways you can do it. You can play soprano and alto as a little duet. You could play soprano and tenor. You could play soprano, alto, tenor. You could play alto and bass. It's kind of fun, just trying different things. One way I use this technique is as it gets closer to service time to start, I find that thinning the harmonic texture, playing fewer voices, going from 4 down to 3, then maybe 2, and again with the bigger breaths between the phrases, really helps people soften their voices. You can also play the voices entering one at a time by phrase for a simple and an interesting way to begin a piece, or you can even use it for a creative introduction to a hymn or your prelude. Any order works fine, but here's an example of simply starting with the soprano for one phrase, adding the alto to it, and then adding the tenor, and then finally the bass. Let's hear how that might sound. You can also make harmonic alterations. I would suggest if you change the harmonies during your hymn, brush up on your theory or look at the handouts in the BYU Organ Workshop packet. But here's a very easy way to make an interesting harmonic alteration. It's called a suspension and basically means holding over one voice from one chord to the next and then resolving to the correct note in the target chord. You can see here that the C from beat 2 is carried over to the chord in beat 3 and then resolves to the B. Let's hear how that sounds. That technique works great during a prelude or a postlude. Not as well when people are singing because then they are not quite sure what pitch to go to, but it's pretty effective as a prelude technique. A deceptive cadence is a great way to create a more final sounding ending. It can also be used if you need a few more seconds of time, such as when the bishop stands and approaches the podium and then turns around to talk to someone else. You know that you need only a few more seconds, so you don't want to restart the piece or play a whole other verse. This also works if you need to shorten the hymn, but you want it to sound more final. A typical authentic cadence or ending is when you go from a 5 or 5/7 chord to a 1 chord. For instance, the 1 chord or tonic chord is built on the first degree of the scale. So a tonic triad or a 1 triad in the key of C major is built on C, C, E, G. A 5 chord is built on the 5th degree of the scale. So in the key of C major, it would be a G major chord, G, B, D. And we often add a 4th note. So in this case, it would be an F. So we often will hear that authentic cadence 5-1. In fact, perfect authentic cadence will have the 5 or the 5th degree of that scale in the bottom, going to the tonic as the root of that chord. A 6 chord, however, is built on the 6th degree of the scale. So in the key of C major, A, C, E, A minor chord would be the sixth chord. Authentic cadences are by far the most common ending of phrases or songs. The listener expects it. It sounds like you're going home. It sounds complete. However, if you play a sixth chord instead of the anticipated one chord, the listener knows to listen for more. You can then replay the final phrase, this time ending on a tonic or a one chord. I often play the final phrase or the final measure or two in augmentation as well for a conclusive feel. This means stretching out or doubling the note value. So again, just listen for this. Instead of going to what we expect to be home, that one chord, the five chord or the fifth degree of the scale is going to simply in that bass move up one note and it will play a sixth chord. It sounds like something more needs to happen. And then if we go back and replay a phrase, this time ending on the cadence that we're expecting, the five to that nice tonic, solid home sounding one chord, we sound like we're done. Let's listen to how that sounds. You can also make tempo alterations. Augmentation was just demonstrated in the replay of that final phrase after the deceptive cadence. You don't have to have a deceptive cadence, of course, to do augmentation. It can be used at other times. An example might be if you're soloing out a melody and you want to add patterns under it or over it, you might augment the solo line or the melody line. It's also fun to play a faster hymn slower as a prelude, maybe The Spirit of God or Rejoice the Lord is King, playing it a little slower than is expected. It's kind of fun. People hear it and they recognize it, but it sounds different. Experiment. Just changing the overall tempo can change the effect of a recognizable tune. So here are some interesting ideas for different types of chorus registrations. Actually, not yet. What we are going to talk about is changing registration for each verse. So if you change your registration for each verse, it sounds like you're playing a medley. Maybe it sounds like there is a difference. It sounds like you're not just playing straight through the hymn. If you do this, however, you want to make sure that you're doing it in the clear break or breath between your verses. Using pistons to accomplish this is really, really helpful. We've had classes in the workshop this week that covered how to set pistons if you're unfamiliar. Toe studs can accomplish the same thing. You're welcome, of course, to reach up and touch a rocker knob or pull a draw knob, but you don't need to use pistons for quick registration changes. You can also do the solo and accompaniment that we've talked about, or you can change registration for verses specifically to highlight the text or the mood. For instance, I love playing the last verse of Come, Come Ye Saints. Very somber. It goes with the text. It makes people think of that text. And then it becomes brighter registration for the triumphal closing final phrases. So you can experiment with that. Some hymns that are designed for the sacrament also speak of Jesus on the cross, and then he rises from the tomb. Nice time to change and be a little creative with it. Even if you're not having people sing during that and you're playing a prelude or postlude, people will understand that because they know the text. It's recognizable and identifiable. And so here are some interesting ideas for different types of chorus registrations. It sounds like an arrangement even if you simply change registration between verses, as we said. So refer to the registration classes and the handouts in this workshop if you really want more information. But here's just some quick outlines, things that you can experiment with. So you can take the handout to your organ and try. Obviously, you can see that these suggestions are going from softer to louder. You can also add a creative introduction to your prelude or your postlude arrangement. Here's a really easy one. Just add a fanfare to a lively postlude. It simply involves playing a tonic chord pattern, or as we talked about before, the one chord, on the swell with an 8-foot trumpet stop and usually backed up with an 8-foot principal. And then you jump to the great manual for the start of the hymn. Again, whether it's postlude or you're playing it as an introduction for people to sing to. It can also be played between verses as well as an interlude, again, as a postlude or when people are singing along. So very easy. This hymn is in the key of B flat major. And so the triad that I'm playing on is B flat. Of course, you can get creative and move around in the harmonic structure, but this is a very simple way to get started using it. It just requires the move from one manual to the other. Here's how it sounds. You can also bridge 2 or more hymns to create a medley. It's easiest if you pick ones in the same key, or you can, again, brush up on your theory and learn modulations. That is covered in the advanced organist class outlines. So this is pretty easy to do if they're in the same key. Nice idea is to create a binder of hymns that thematically go together. So they're in order. You can just move through your binder, or if you're using an electronic tool or an iPad to do that, again, stack them in there so that they are together. You can also print the hymns from church websites in whatever key you choose. And also, of course, lay out your hymns in that binder in order of like all of the D majors together, all of the C majors together. Just a really easy way to help yourself be able to get through. You're not thumbing through the hymnal. Even if you use the hymnal and you put little tabs in, I find it can be a little clumsy to get around. So creating a binder for yourself or using an iPad and storing them on electronically is a great way to get through that. So you can just bridge a number of hymns together. I find it really is a nice idea if you play multiple verses of the same hymn rather than 10 different hymns during your 5 minutes of prelude. I find that it helps people really focus on the text. They start really cluing into what that hymn is, and they tend to pay attention and listen to it. So use your registration changes or some of the things that we're talking about today to be able to play multiple verses. So you don't have to. You can certainly string 10 together and play in the 5-10 minute time period. But don't be creative and use multiple verses. I think it's a fun way to be able to do that. So rather than just stringing them together, you can also, to maybe tie it in, make it sound more like a something that belongs together, is you can play one verse or two of one hymn, play another hymn, and then you can play the first hymn again, or even just a little tidbit of it, so that it kind of ties it in and ties it together. And I'll be demonstrating that for you in just a few minutes. So here's a really easy way to bridge 2 hymns. You can play a recognizable phrase, often the first phrase, from the hymn that you just played, and then you end with the final phrase of the new hymn that you're going to. As you see right here, that this one requires an adjustment of the time signature because they're not the same. All you have to do is add or subtract a beat for a seamless transition. Here's how that might sound. So, what if you need to shorten or lengthen your prelude? Well, be flexible. Practice ending points. So, you might want to kind of take a look at the cadences or those endings that sound like 5-1. Practice them. Maybe even mark them in your score as to where they are so you don't panic when the bishop stands up and really wants to start right away. You know that you have exit points. Makes you feel a lot more comfortable as you do it. Let's talk about that for a minute, though, too. Here's a little suggestion. If you have a bishopric member or a leader who really wants you to just stop dead in the water as soon as they stand up and want to start, I would suggest just a little communication with them ahead of time really helps. It sounds a little jarring to people when you have to do that. So, of course, practice. Practice being able to do 5-1 wherever you're at so that you can adjust if you really don't have a stopping point outlined in advance. But also just communicate with that bishopric member and say, hey, would you please give me a few extra seconds to be able to end this beautifully, and it will sound more settled to people. Again, people want that feeling of going home that a 5 to a 1 creates for them. If you leave them hanging, it sounds very unsettled. So just communicate. I found that most bishopric members will listen to reason if you just talk to them in advance about it. You can also practice entrance points. So you might replay the last phrase, or you might start again and then know where your exit points are. Deceptive cadence with the last phrase, and then maybe repeat the last phrase. Again, augmentation makes it sound kind of final if you need to do that somewhere along the way, or even at the end if you just want a little bit more. So you can also start from the beginning or do selected phrases. You can reduce the texture the next time around. You can change your registration, change the tempo. A lot of things that you can do that will just make it sound a little bit different. Another thing, if you want to get kind of creative, is that you can just play around a little bit, not playing the melody, drop the melody, and just simply play alto, tenor, bass, or something kind of just kind of nice and what we call noodling around. You can use that harmonic structure in your piece as long as the melody isn't recognizable. So again, kind of a fun way. You'll want to practice that ahead and get used to it, but it's just a fun way to be able to add a little bit of filler and without the real identifiable melody being heard, it's a lot easier to kind of find those stopping points. So some ideas for shortening or lengthening your prelude by a little bit if you need to. So let's put it all together. All these things that we've learned, we've talked about, some great techniques, but I've just given you little snips. Let's put it together in an actual piece of prelude. So this utilizes most of the skills and the techniques that we've talked about today. So I'll show them to you. We'll do a very brief walkthrough, and then you'll actually see the score. That's what that extra handout was. You'll see the score while you'll hear it being played. So don't panic, as you see it in the next couple of slides that you might not have seen it all. Not a real problem. But let me give you a very, very brief overview. So we will be starting with the voices entering one at a time. And then you'll hear a solo accompaniment with the swell playing the melody on the 16-foot. We'll move through with that alto and kind of a duet sound, as you'll see identified here. And then I have a bridge going from the first to the last. It will have the first phrase of the original hymn with the last phrase of the target hymn. And then you'll see I have what I call a walking bass that I didn't really describe to you, but simply the bass just moves around by step. It's an easy way to add pedal to something because you don't have to jump. So it tends to be a little bit easier to play and a nice way to add that. You can also add it with your hands as well and just play the bass in that. So kind of a fun way. And then as we go towards the close, you'll hear a couple of other things. And then what if the bishop stands up before I actually complete that verse? What am I going to do? Well, I'm going to throw in that deceptive cadence with a little bit of augmentation and then a little snip of that first hymn. Just a little bit of that recognizable melody just makes it sound like it's tied together. So again, here's how it sounds. This is all of these things put together in action. So we presented some techniques today. I would love for you to practice them. Try one at a time. Practice them with lots of different hymns. Incorporate them into your everyday practice, and then start using them on Sunday. Make your own prelude and postlude, even a little at a time. You'll get more and more comfortable with using them. But don't feel like you have to apply them all in one hymn like I did just now. You can start with one at a time and then play the rest of the hymn straight through. Not a problem. Just practice and learn. But most of all, you can do this. Express the meaning of the text. Even though you're not singing, you sing with your hands. This makes all the difference. You can really create a beautiful and meaningful experience for your listeners. And that's really what needs to happen. We're helping people invite the Spirit into their hearts and their minds, preparing them for their worship service. And we can do this. And it's wonderful to have the opportunity to play music. And I just appreciate that you are all here listening, trying, working to improve your skills. That says so much for you. And it makes all the difference for your congregation. They hear it. They know that you are working at it. They can hear the difference, even if they don't know music. It really does make all the difference. And I know this to be true. So have fun, experiment, play with it. It's a lot of fun. We will now turn to some question and answers. So if you have any questions, probably use the chat area, but you can also use question and answer, and I'll answer them. So go ahead and type some in if you haven't already, and I'll take a look at them. So a few people asked for the slides. I am happy to send them out if you would like that. And let's see, questions. So, again, asking for the slides. I can send them out. And how do you decide to use the parallel sixth idea? Or is this something to try on just about any hymn? What I found is that the sixth moving like that don't always work on every hymn. So just experiment with one. I found that a lot of them do. So you want to start, pick a sixth that kind of works at the beginning for you. Often it's not really starting on the tonic note as the root of it. I tend to usually use the tonic in the top with the sixth below it and then move up and down. And when it doesn't really work anymore, you can kind of go down again. If you're using some soft celeste, I find it works pretty well because they're soft. And so if your solo line, it's fairly tolerant anyway. So try it and see what it works for you. And what is your favorite hymn playing experience? Wow. I don't even know if I have a favorite hymn playing experience because I love playing hymns. And for me, I love to prepare the hymns. So I always look at my hymns in advance, even though for many decades I can play pretty much any hymn in the hymnal, of course. I still always prepare my hymns in advance because I want to know that I'm prepared. I want to know that I've looked over and looked for any problems, but I also read the text and I pray about it. I really try to bring that text into my heart and my mind so that when I'm playing it, whether it's a prelude or whether it's for congregational singing, I'm feeling and hearing and understanding that text, as well as being able to help the congregation hear the phrasing and the breath. So pretty much I always have favorite hymn playing experiences because I love that experience of interacting with the text, even if I'm playing a prelude where there is not something being sung. So I have a question. What do you recommend during COVID when we are playing solos of the hymns without the congregation singing? Can we embellish? Yes, I think this is a great time to embellish at least a bit. They really need usually, if it's during a spot. So some congregations are only doing prelude, postlude, and the sacrament hymn during the preparation time. And in fact, a lot of churches are doing that too, of all denominations. However, some I have heard of that are playing hymns where it's being heard and the congregation is invited to sing along in their minds. They can look at their phones since mostly the hymnals have been taken out of the pews. And at that point, I would make sure that your solo line is very clear. But if they're not singing 4-part choral harmony, I can't imagine anybody in their head is singing an alto line. They're going to hear the text with the melody in their head. So at that point, I think it's fine to embellish. Any other questions that I can answer for you? I'll make sure there's nothing in the chat. I hope that you have all enjoyed this a lot. I do have a question here. Do you try mixing hymns with different tempos and keys? Dearest children, God is near you, joined with far, far away. That's a very interesting idea. I think you can mix anything. However, it's got to sound good. So I assume that by mixing, you mean making a medley out of it. So if you're going from one hymn to another hymn, and especially if you're trying to kind of create a message, I love that idea of dearest children, God is near you with far, far away, the near and the far. Very interesting idea. And people, surprisingly, even if you're playing a prelude and they're not hearing the text, they do get these messages. However, if you're going from one to the other, probably best not to just abruptly change. Look for how to modulate. And again, I'm not going to cover that today, just for the interest of time, but it is covered in the theory portions of the workshop as well, how to make those changes. Someone asked, are there any no-nos or things to definitely avoid? You pretty much want to follow good harmonic structure. If it sounds funny, it probably sounds funny to other people too. And if the more you learn about theory, the more you kind of understand that. Otherwise, I think, the sky's the limit. If it sounds good, I would definitely recommend having somebody listen to your prelude that you've come up with, or always record yourself and listen to it. And then you'll hear if something sounds like it's a no-no. Usually things will stand out in your mind as well. And so somebody asked about explaining the toccata technique. So a toccata, it tends to be a piece that is, in fact, it means kind of to touch. It's something that's going to be a pattern generally, not always, but in every toccata. But a toccata technique that I was referring to is simply a pattern that is, you can play it under or over. In this instance, I showed it with the pedal line playing the melody, and then I just played the patterns in my hands. So again, if you're just outlining a chord with it and come up with a very consistent pattern, you just move when the chord changes. You can see it in your music generally. That's kind of how you play, and it can be any technique that you want, any pattern. I just kind of came up with a little simple one for you. Another question, we're singing again with Mass, but the congregation is socially distanced. How do you support a small socially distanced congregation? Let's talk about that. That kind of goes a little bit along the lines of how loud should I be playing in my meeting, in my service? We always want to play loud enough that we are supporting our congregation. They need confidence that they can hear their notes, that they can feel like, because most people are awkward singers. Some people are trained or at least comfortable singing. Most people aren't. And so they don't want to be singing louder than the organ in their ears. So something that will support them, whatever that is, get somebody to stand out and listen or whatever. And now we have a different situation. Now we have limited numbers of people in there. They're wearing masks. So I'm impressed. That's actually the first one I've heard of anybody wearing masks in any denomination, including the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Singing is a little muffled with masks. So kind of an interesting thing. So you're not going to want to be overbearing because it's a smaller group, but it does need to fill the room and at least have them feel comfortable. So I hope that answered that for you. I have another question. Do you ever use the 16-foot stop with congregational singing? I've heard some organists use it, and personally, I think it's too heavy. I agree. The 16-foot on the manuals tends to be pretty heavy unless it's a very light one, and it depends on your organ. You have to listen to it. Generally, I do not do that. The predominant area that I use a 16-foot stop on manuals is when I am playing Baroque music. So not during sacrament meeting. I wouldn't ever do that with congregational singing. So again, unless it's a real light one, it does kind of muddy it up. So an 18-foot an 8-foot principle sounds very clear to people. They can hear their pitches really well. So we kind of usually want to build on top of that so they can hear it. So I agree. Generally it's too heavy. So another question, do you do pivot chords to change keys between hymns ever? Yes, that's a modulation. The pivot chord, real simply, what a pivot chord is, it's the same chord, but in a different position in both keys. So for instance, let's look at the key of G major and the key of C major. So in the key of C major, G major triad, GBD, is the 5 chord. But in the key of G major, GBD, that G major chord is a tonic chord. So when we try to modulate, so very briefly, and this could be alarming, don't let it alarm anybody. When we modulate, we frequently will use the pivot chord because it's the easiest way to get there. And we play that chord that functions well in the old key and in the new key. For instance, the G major chord works great in C and G major because it's the same chord. And then we try to aim towards maybe a 4 chord or something that's predominant to the dominant, the 5/7 to the 1. So hopefully that answered that question. Yes, pivot chords in a modulation is a great way to change keys. What would you suggest for registrations for these hymns while the congregations aren't singing? Yes. So my suggestion for registrations is still something that people could hear clearly, because if they're not singing and they're simply looking at the text and trying to listen to it, I would still stick with maybe not an overbearing kind of registration, but maybe an 8 and 4 foot principle, so that, again, they could hear their pitches clearly, even though they're not really singing. However, if you're doing prelude or sacrament preparation song, where it's not really kind of filling the same spot where people would be singing, I think you have a lot more flexibility. Would you recommend printing out your preludes before the service or play it from memory? Okay, here's my suggestion. Unless you are a fantastic memorizer, or there's some reason, or you feel like it's showing something, I think you are absolutely welcome to print it out and write things on it. I always put things all over my music. Registration changes, I write things in, because all you need is to get under pressure, or something happened, or someone's talking to you and disturbing you, and now you don't remember. Your memory is your flow is disrupted. So, I would suggest printing it out unless there's some need to memorize. Memorizing is a great tool, though. You can memorize and still use your score up there, which is nice, but at least then you have the thing to fall back on, or registration changes or notes. So that's my suggestion. Someone else is wearing masks and singing too. Wow. Okay. This is new. I haven't heard of anyone singing with masks. So great. I guess with social distancing. So if that's the case, you will be they will be then singing, again, smaller crowd with masks on, a little more muffled. You're probably going to be down a little bit in your volume than you might normally, but they still need enough to support them. So super soft and the Spirit of God probably won't really cut it. And someone asked again about the slides, and no, I have your email addresses through the Big Marker webinar service, so I'll just send them out to you with that. So no problem. Okay, and I have maybe 1 more minute for questions, so I will answer these last couple that are in already. Is there a way to bring out the tenor line a bit more? It always seems to be drowned out by the soprano, alto, and bass in the feet. Maybe it's the type of stops I'm using, but it seems that anything on the church organ that is played on the grate below middle C is not really heard. I don't like to use the bass coupler to add the bass foot pedal sound up to the grate, but should I use that to bring in the tenor for the grate keyboard? No, I wouldn't do that. Just listen to your stops. Some stops you'll find carry just a little bit better under that C than others. So try to add something to it. You can add a little bit of brilliance. So I assume you mean for congregational singing. if you really want to bring out a tenor line, not for congregational singing, but or even maybe during congregational singing, you could play the tenor if you're playing your pedals with the bass line. You could play your tenor even on another manual, on another stop, so it can be heard a little bit more, especially if it happens to be an interesting one, or maybe for one verse. But other than that, no, I would not use the bass coupler and the pedals. It's going to get really muddy sounding and won't really help your tenor either. So just listen for the stops. Usually some upper work will help. Maybe add a 2-foot, and you'll hear a little bit more there. Make sure that you're using a really nice principal chorus. Flutes tend to get muddy, especially when they're lower like that. So maybe not so many flutes, more principals. Great. So then let's see. Oh, more singing with mass. Wow, that's amazing. There's a lot of it. Okay. We are social distance okay, yeah. So I'm just glad to hear that people are getting back to church and still singing. That's awesome. Wonderful. Chord progressions are, someone had asked about some suggested chord progressions. There are actually some handouts that are already distributed from some of the other classes that cover that. So just look in your BYU organ workshop packet and you should see some chord progressions listed there as well and how to do that. So great way to do that. And I hope that lots of people wanted the slides. Absolutely, I will send out the slides. So great, it's been wonderful. I will let you go on to your next classes, but thank you so much for the great questions and again, for your great service and your time in learning and working to understand and to improve your skills. Thank you. Have a good rest of your day.